I thank you very much for coming. I hope no one gets vertigo sitting up there. But anyway, I'm sure you all heard of Indian Hannah or Hannah Freeman. Otherwise, she might not have come here. She's an interesting person because at one point she was a household name. She was covered by all the newspaper stories, obviously later. Plaques, there's several plaques about her, or markers, including her road is named after her, Indian Hannah Road in Newland. And she had ups and downs in terms of coverage, as I should say. The 19th century and also 1930s, the historian Albert Cook Myers, who was with the Pennsylvania Historical Commission, he was a William Penn historian, but by default, he talked about Indian Hannah a lot. And he said that at one point in Chester County, the residents in the late 1700s always had a memory, or personal or otherwise, of the Lenape people. They also heard about the Brandywine battle.
David Lichter is in the library. Someone found your phone in the parking lot, and we have it at the front desk.
Excuse me. Anyway, they remembered the Brandywine battle in September 11, 1777. That was like their 9/11 as well. It was interesting that all the paperwork, they called her Hannah Freeman, so she became better known as that. This is a painting by Adrian Martinez of Downingtown. I'm sure you've heard of him. He did this in part of this exhibit he had at the Chester County History Center on Humphrey Marshall, the botanist, which we will hear about more. But I think it's interesting, there's never been a photo, drawing, anything, even though she lived at a time where there were a lot of artists. The time actually Peale did the painting of Benjamin Franklin, but he just based this on her descriptions of her, and he always does like two perspectives. You see her walking out towards under the moon, like maybe joining her people, or being the last of her race, staying behind. We'll find out why she was called that. She's also carving something. There's some horns there. She was well known for collecting herbs and her medicine, and she would actually go to people's houses and sort of help them with their herbal medicine. I'm just going to read one part that Adrian writes about her. Hannah Freeman lived a conventional, if mean, material existence. She had odd jobs, planted small patches of corn, squash, beans, and raised a few pigs and cows. Though she was typical of numerous people struggling to get by in the backcountry, she saw herself as a person very much apart. Clinging to the seasonal rounds, she was described by a contemporary as grandly traveling along the roads as though she was queen of the whole neighborhood. That sounds like she's very snobby, but it's very confident. She seemed to be aware of the profound responsibility she had to her people, past, present, and future. She felt she was sort of a placeholder. This proud sense of self-worth, regardless of how absurd it may have appeared to other people like whites, revealed her commitment to the belief that despite everything, one day her people would return to the Brandywine Valley. The next one. You should work. Oh yeah, okay, this is a painting by Frolic Weymouth. He lived in the Big Bend. We'll see his house later. It's called Indian Hannah, and if you didn't know the fact that there was a legend about everywhere she left, she was always traveling around. Where she had lived was where the bluebells were, grew up. You wouldn't know that, but it's sort of interesting that he sort of continued her legend. Let's go ahead and click the next one. This is Westchester, and you don't think about Indian Hannah being connected to Westchester, but she was in two ways. One, she had to give a testimony to get into the poorhouse, which I'll explain, and so she apparently traveled to Westchester. She also was supposedly sold baskets and brooms in a booth in the market house, which means that she was very much a part of regular people, and that's one of the reasons why people remember her so well. Next. Okay, this is another painting by Adrian, and he decided, it's called, you take this testimony. You had to prove, you had that a testimony was sort of like an intake procedure to get into the poorhouse. And they did this way before even the Hanna House. The Chester County Quakers had a long system of foster care, which they would have, like, they would say, old Betty needed to stay someplace, so they'll pay someone to take care of her. But you would go through, make sure old Betty was a part of Chester County. You had to ask where she had lived. And so he's imagining this taking place in one of the meeting houses. This is Moses Marshall, who happened to be a nephew of Humphrey Marshall. We'll hear about him later, but at that point, he was the overseer of the poor. He had sort of a traumatic life in terms of wanted to be a doctor. He went to medical school, and he ended up helping the wounded at the Battle of Brandywine. And judging from his one diary, I think he had sort of post-traumatic stress disorder. He was always like hopping around to fun, going to bars and drinking and stuff. And his uncle said, "Oh, I want you to travel and gather plants for me instead." But as soon as Humphrey Marshall died, he quit. But anyway, he ended up helping with the overseer. So he basically took a testimony about her. You could do the next one. Next slide. This is a stamp I made up. Later on, they would stamp this on your paperwork. If you proved to live in Delaware County, they would say, "Not our pauper." Obviously, when you look at the testimony for Hannah, it's almost like she's a man because she wasn't married at the time. She never mentioned her husband, although she did have a husband. But if you must have worked or rented property in Chester County for 1 year, and a married woman or widow was considered a resident of the place where her husband resided, they didn't talk about whether women didn't have a husband. There were cases later on of the people lying to get in, and then they would send people out to like the local taverns and find out, "Oh no, you didn't live in Chester County. You had to tell everybody." So this is, again, it's the idea of establishing roots. And this seems sort of like cut and dry, but it's actually better than the previous system in Chester County. Is if you were poor, you had to wear the letter P, like the scarlet letter. And if you took it off, you were supposed to protect you from being harassed or anything if you were sleeping outdoors. Go ahead, the next one. I don't expect you to read this, but you can glance at it. This is just a part of the examination, as they call it, of Indian Hannah. It's sort of run-on sentences, but it basically explains, where was she going, where was she doing. As I told you, she missed a lot of things. And what's unfortunate about this, she never talks about any of the Indian settlements because, of course, she probably doesn't think she knows of it. Again, I also thought it's unusual. Moses Marshall writes this down, but he never mentions that one of her longest stay was with the Marshall family and also Humphrey Marshall. And I'm thinking he is a Quaker, he was working, he probably didn't want to say, he's doing a job, he doesn't want to say, "I know this person." So basically, he just took all this down. The reason, as I said, this is why we know so much about her, including when we think she was born, and the different places she lived, and we'll go over that thing. I thought it was interesting. Later on, Mr. Cook Myers, he's the historian in the 1930s, he seized on this, and he loved to be able to talk about, how self-sufficient she was. And of course, this is during the Depression, so it's like, let's follow what Indian Hannah did. And he often talked about how she had 2 dogs, a cow, a horse, and after her family disappeared from the area, she was described about moving about from place to place, making baskets and staying longest were best used. The Quakers often made a lot about how she didn't have a home and she was wandering around, but actually the Lenapes, that's what they did. They were seasonal, they were agriculture, they would move around for hunting, they would just stay in this area for the summer. So they didn't, when you read this thing, you could see how they misunderstand her. The next one. In fact, this is the takeaways I have here. The mode of living of place to place, they said that was bad. This is why she needed to, find a place like the poorhouse to stay at. And it's funny how they said her mother died about the time Thomas Buffington's wife died. Like, okay, do we know when that was? And then also, it says the county becoming more settled. The Indians were not allowed to plant corn, and her father went to Smokin, which is the Susquehanna River Valley, never returned. a lot of male Indians went there because obviously it was a big fur trading place and they could trade up there. But when they say plant corn, it's really sort of like it's not that they were planting corn, they couldn't do that. It means that they couldn't, have land. They couldn't take over the land that the settlers claimed. So that was sort of a metaphor. And they tried to say that she left her family on her own accord. One part of the testimony says she went to Concord, but having forgot to talk Indian and not liking their manner of living, like she only liked the white people, she came back to Kennett and lived at William Webb's and worked for her board sometimes, but got no money except for baskets and brooms. They made it seem that she didn't have any way to make a living towards the end. This is all the testimony for her to be taken over to go to the poorhouse. And I'm beginning this first so you can see you'll see the different contexts she had. So the next one. This, you probably recognize, this is what they call the meadow in Longwood. I have another quote there. They always say, she wouldn't have used the word cabins, but they always say cabins, that they stayed there in Kennett and sometimes Center, which is in Delaware. So, and when the Indians were killed in Lancaster, we'll see that. That's a Paxton murder, boy's murder. We'll see that later. But basically, we do think she was born here in the William Webb household. And what's interesting is a lot of times when she stayed with it, they would let them stay in the winter and she would learn how to sew with his daughter, Hannah. They think maybe that's how she got named Hannah. And also, other tribes often stayed around the area because, especially in the winter, but normally the winter they would go all the way up to New York before the white man because they would go hunt there, but the hunting territories were shrinking, so they had to find places to be safe. And at that point, there were so many more women than men, and so they felt like they had to hitch themselves to one of the white settlers in order to survive the winter. So go ahead with that. This is one of her baskets, and what's unusual about it was you think about someone that's selling baskets at the the market house in Westchester, baskets and brooms, and they said also mats. I don't know whether that meant floor mats or whatever. You think there would be more samples. This was owned by the Bernard family, and that was one of the last people she stayed with before she went to the poorhouse. In fact, they say one of the Bernards took her to Westchester so she would give her testimony. I should get a color picture. I actually went into the Historic Society. They don't have it on display, but she was known for dyeing different things. So this is actually red and green dye. And the librarian there was telling me that, they have to keep it lock and key because it's so fragile. But in the 60s and 70s, whenever they had an event, they would let's take Indian Hannah's basket. They would just have a table of food and people could just, pick it up and do whatever they wanted to it. But it is a very delicate basket. But this is sort of the last remaining thing of her. Next. This is, good guess. This is one of my favorite paintings of William Penn. It's actually called The Dreamer, and it's by Oakley, Violet Oakley. This is actually at in the Capitol in Harrisburg. It's one of the many murals. And what's interesting about it is she chose to have him be in Oxford. People forget how well educated he was. He was from a very wealthy family. I always thought, well, if he was around in the Vietnam War, he would be definitely, even though he was Quaker, he would be part of that whole movement of anti-war and anti-establishment, because basically he got Penn's Woods because his father worked for the king, and the king had a big debt, so he paid Penn's family gave him money, so he ended up saying, what can I do with my son? Because he kept joining the Quakers, and the Quakers came about when there was no crown, when they had the Commonwealth, and then they went back, and certainly they were get these Quakers out of here. So, and he was imprisoned and things, so his father said, take this land, so he became, Penn's Woods was Pennsylvania. But it's a dreamer because he wanted to have a peaceable kingdom. Everybody, would be living peaceably along the Indians. The next one here. In fact, I always thought it was interesting. He did many, many brochures, and they're almost like a developer's brochure. This was one to the Free Society of Traders, which they had their headquarters in what is now Society Hill. That's why the name dropped and became Society Hill. But he often talked about, he had another one, that he wanted to get people to go there because he needed the money, he needed people to come and settle, and so he tried to get everybody to come, like workmen and all sorts of diverse people, besides everybody else that was being prosecuted, like the German Lutherans, the Mennonites, of course, the Quaker. But he tried to get people to say, let's not disturb the Indians that are here. So he said, let it be the Jew have the liberty to do things, or everything, or a planter, which is another name for a settler. I thought it was interesting. His other brochure, which I couldn't get a copy of, is called Concessions and, let me see, what is it? Certain Conditions and Concessions. And that is where he sets things up about if you take down trees, try to plant other trees, and don't disturb the Indians. But he was also very much the fact that he was sort of smart about this because the Swedes had already been here for 40 years. They already had a government in Upland, which later became Chester. So he just let everybody in place. And they also knew how to live with the Indians because they had been trading with them. The thing about the Swedes, they never went further than really the Susquehanna. They just sort of like farmed along the Delaware and the Susquehanna River, and they didn't really go inland. And they also thought that this would work out. They had no idea that there were going to be hordes of English people coming under William Penn. So, and the next one here. So this is a painting by Benjamin West. And it's interesting, when I first saw this, I said, well, what are they doing with some houses in the back? But actually, this is Fishtown now. There were houses there because I said the Swedes settled it earlier. What's famous about this is the main chief, they didn't have, like the Quakers, they didn't have one leader. They had many leaders. Everybody believed in the consensus. And one of the guys that were main guy was Tamarud, Chef Tamarud. Later on, ironically, have you heard of it? Tammany, that was like a political system in New York that became very corrupt. It was named for him. But George Washington, everybody else loved the idea of this, this Indian bringing in democracy, to having peaceful ideas. In fact, the Lenapes weren't part of the Six Nations, but I understand, I haven't seen the movie yet, but the American Revolution movie that's coming up, we talked by Ken Burns, he talks about the Six Nations and how they were the oldest democracy and how they got together, had all the Indian tribes, but not the Lenape in it, but all these other Indians agreed to it, and they set things up. So he was a perfect person to, say, greet William Penn. But and there are a lot more. So he has this, a family here with a baby. The next one. This is by Edward Hicks. I don't know if you know about him, but he was a Quaker in Bucks County, and he got sort of obsessed with the idea of peaceable kingdom. He painted like hundreds and hundreds of pictures. Only one of the treaty, William Penn Treaty 1681. That's when he supposedly met these Indians as soon as they got off the boat and signed this thing and said, here, I'll trade you. William Penn also believed in buying things. Of course, the things he traded were like stockings and tobacco and barrels of, guns. But he didn't believe in just taking land from the Indians. What this thing is sort of interesting, I said everybody thinks there was just one treaty, but there were dozens of treaties afterwards. But this is the most famous one because it's the first one. Actually, there should be one little building in there because apparently Hicks was later, I think he was like late 1700s. He admired Benjamin West, and he based his painting on it. You see it over to the left there. You can do the next slide. I think we have Peaceable Kingdom. This is a peaceable kingdom. Of course, you see William Penn down there again, where the idea of what, the Indians were going to help us, and actually, they did help us a lot. The Lenapes, I said, they just figured that they were dealing with more Swedes that weren't going to be taking over. And actually, William Penn also saw the many advantages, and one was because the Lenape were constantly traveling to hunt and that kind of thing, They said that you could see woods for miles, but there would be no underbrush. It was very easy. And then they had many, many trails, like the road to Paxton is Harrisburg. That all these trail roads that we still have today, they were Indian trails, and so it was right away. William Penn said, "This is going to be easy. We're just going to, clear the Indian paths." Also, in places like Warwick, the Warwick is the beginning of the iron country. They discovered that the Indians supposedly showed William Penn what he was doing up in Warwick. I don't know, but either showed it to other people that there was iron ore that was very easily mined. It was through the surface. So we had limestone, we had iron ore, and so therefore we also had lots of trees or charcoal. So therefore we had the first iron forges in the nation. And when Quakers would show us different things, they always talk about the Indians at Thanksgiving, showing us how to, plant corn, but really it was really the Lenapes that did so much. Go ahead. In fact, I'll just briefly tell you, what's neat is that when I talked about they didn't live in cabins, they lived in longhouses because they weren't related to the Algonquin. In fact, I thought it was interesting, there were a lot of similarities to the Quaker. They had generations that lived in one house, just like the Quakers that came here. They would all buy land in the same territory here and stay for generations. And the most crucial thing is, like the Quakers didn't have a minister, they didn't have one chief. Everybody had to come together. And they also had women could do things as well as men. But the next one is sort of interesting that was of all the people to meet, William Penn, it's a good thing he met the Lenapes. In fact, that one Lenape, Tamavy, was from the Brandywine Turtle clan, which is where Indian Hanna was from. This was actually, it's called the Delaware Indians. They always say, the Delaware Indians, we'll see, that's a misnomer. But this kind of thing was published in London, so people could say, oh, it's a nice family. They're not going to murder us or anything when we come here. The Lenape themselves, it's Lenape, Lenape. That's another Indian word for means original men or true men. They thought they were the original people, which in a way they were because they took so much the East Coast up. The next one I'll show you. It's amazing, you see why Delaware River is very small, it goes up this part, but yet they went all the way up, and there are 50 different clans, all the way up to New York. In fact, they say one Lenape clan is the one that sold Manhattan to the Dutch for like 50 guilders. But you can see all the different clans and the different dialects, but they were all related to the Algonquin. And that's probably why, we have the Algonquin Hotel in New York and other things. So next one. So you think about all the different people. How can Indian Hanna be the last of her race when we had so many Lenape? But in Chester County, it was a different case. Chester County, this is it's right near Stroud Reserve. This is one of the oldest barns in Chester County along this is from a hill, so you might not even see it. That road is Brandywine Creek, and you're out of view is the Strasburg. But what is interesting is things might have worked out if we still had a fur trade business. See, the Indians were used to, trading with the Swedes, and at one point, of course, even Logan, that's Penn's right-hand man. He made a fortune on the fur trade, but that was going to be, eventually this is going to dry up. But at one point, they switched to wheat, and this is what literally called the breadbasket of America. We often think about how, no wonder the Indians were pushed out of here because, this is the Philadelphia capital was here. So this is really the birthplace of the nation. Plus, Chester County at that point was a lot larger. It included parts of Delaware, included parts of Lancaster. And Lancaster, both Philadelphia and Lancaster during the American Revolution, Lancaster was the largest inland community. So we're sort of in between that. And the wheat, by the way, this is an old English style because they used to thresh the wheat outside, but it got such a big business. That's why we developed these big barns with threshing floors and things, because once we grew wheat, that means a lot more land. And, we're definitely going to take the Indians' land at that case. The next one, look at the deer down there. This is the same picture by a photographer in the 19th century, Max Mueller. He was a doctor. He liked to fish. He lived in Elverson. He liked to come down and fish. But it's interesting, you still see, everybody knows this. Taylor family were also supporters of Indian Hannah at one point. We'll look at that. They supported her and let her live there. And Deborah Taylor was also well known, she was known in the community for helping the poor and helping local Lenape Indians. In fact, the next one, you do the next one. This is still there. This is taken by Mueller again. This is called Deborah's Rock. It's about diagonally from that house before you get to Cope's Bridge going into Marshallton. That rock, I should have a contemporary, you can hardly see it, but this is a famous legend. I said, once they got so fascinated about this Indian name, I think her name was Betty, but she fell in love with a Quaker boy, and then she ended up jumping to her death of this. But for some reason, all the churches and everybody, they love to talk about this. The Indian, these Indians are hysterical. They're not going to stay around here anyway. They're jumping to their deaths, but they love these kind of stories that would be in the newspapers. And apparently the churches love to have picnic. They have a picnic grove in front of it. You see the fence up there. It's pretty steep. But anyway, that's one example of why, Indian Hannah, she was preserved in memory probably because she was so ingrained with the white people, and then she wasn't, these other stories were all about, the Indians are fanatics or whatever. Anyway, the next one. I just put this in. This is not the same. She grew up in Northbrook, and that's on the West Branch, but this is the East Branch. I only put this in because this rock, if anybody that's here from Marshallton, you go over Cope's Bridge and you can still see that rock. And of course, they had a legend about the Indians getting on that rock and shooting arrows into the river to fish. But that's another case where I don't even know, it wasn't really near their they had regular settlements. There was no really settlements. Marshallton was settled pretty early in the 1700s, so there wouldn't be any reason for them to come up and fish there. Go ahead. This is a sign that still exists right near the Northbrook Bridge. And I always said it's sort of confusing because it says, this stream below, there's a rock, and this is where the Indian lands were. Well, that's because originally they were given, this is what they call the first reservation. About, I guess it was 1600s, Penn gave them land on either side of the Brandywine as far as a man can walk. So that length, that was from Wilmington all the way up to Honeybrook. That's 60 miles. That's exactly, at that point, they didn't even know where the Brandywine ended, but they thought it was Honeybrook. Well, at one point, because of Newland, if you heard of Nicholas Newland of Newland Township, he ignored that and he just developed all this land. He's almost like the first developer. It's ironic that the township has a road named after Indian Hannah because he took so much of the Indian land and sold it to the Free Society. And anyway, we'll see that in the next slide. But after that, they renegotiated and said, okay, we're going to give you the land from Northbrook to Honeybrook. They figured that it's way up there. The white man's not going to want to settle up there. Go ahead. This is really interesting. This was one guy, I don't want to pronounce his name, but he was also called Brother Gideon because he became adopted Moravian, and he was a baptized Moravian. His Indian name means person of few words. But it's interesting, he and some other people actually, he's wearing a Moravian outfit. He's sort of like the classic guy that tried to deal with it. They always say Indians had no sense of land or anything, that their land could be taken because they didn't, the land belonged to no one, But that's necessarily true because they knew at this point that we had surveys, we had patents, we had all sorts of systems settling, and they didn't like, what really got them is the system of anybody, if you didn't settle your land right away, and a squatter, you could squat there, you could just get the land. So he went in and he fought Newland. He went into Philadelphia with these other people in 1724. He also admired, I said, the 5 nations of peace. His translator was Harlan, a guy named Harlan, who squatted and got the big bend. And so he had some alternative motives. He promoted people like Newland, which what he did, Newland just went in and notched these trees and did a survey when the Indians are away. And they said, well, you're away, we could take your land, you were disappeared, you abandoned your property. So, the person of few words, he could only get, unfortunately, he couldn't show anything because the original paperwork that Penn had given, which is the same thing that happened to the 5 Indians, their paperwork was burned. It seems like their paperwork from Penn was always like burned in a fire, but that was like 40 years later. So he often said, I want you to keep a copy, that's the government, and I'll keep a copy. This is the land office. But they agreed, finally, they asked Newland to apologize, and he sort of apologized. Logan kept saying, Newland is a very good friend of William Penn. And anyway, he agreed that he would not disturb the Indians, and they could sort of like fish around his land, but he had already officially had bought this land he bought it from the Society of Traders, and he was going to carve it up for people. So he'd already put money into it, and there's no way he's going to give it up. So he never claimed, he said he would not disturb the Indians, but he never said he would vacate the land. And because of this, they also tried to get the local government to say, you're not going to give us rum or anything. Our children are drinking rum, and that's not a fair price to give me rum for land. So from 1724 to up in 1729, he continued to go to the Philadelphia Land Office and ask for different agreements. And it naturally had to do with dams and fishing. As you know, when you give half the whole Brandywine away, or even up to Northbrook, all these people are putting mills, you can't control it. I don't know why William Penn was thinking that no one would want the land on either side of the Brandywine, except the Indians. But anyway, his son, by the way, also did a lot of, helped with the Native Americans to go to Allegheny. He led the lead to go to the Allegheny Mountains in the Ohio Valley. Another thing interesting, he talked to 2 governors in 1716 and another one in 1729. And he finally gave up, and he moved to what they call again, Shamokin, which is not the same town as Shamokin now, but it's sort of, it's east of there. That's an Indian word. It means place of eels. And unfortunately there, he was murdered. His cabin set on fire while he was in it. He was sleeping and he died. So that was in 1763. So, he was the one who really tried to negotiate, and that was like give up, But as I said, they all went, he was originally from the Brandywine, Northbrook group. In fact, actually, all the territory, they misunderstood him because he happened to be he came down from Reading and came down, and they thought he lived up there. So they didn't understand, again, why he was traveling so much. So they would always say, formerly of the Brandywine. So next slide. This is another reason why we know about Indian Hannah, is because the line about last of her race was from a poetry book. This is John Russell Hayes. I joke, I was reading about his brother. It was discovered in 1824. This is near Northbrook, by a guy hunting groundhogs, and his dogs dug up the first of two skeletons. And it turns out these skeletons were excavated. They went to Swarthmore College because that's where I said Mr. Hayes, he was a librarian there. He was also an author, and as I said, other things. But he wrote many books about the Quaker, all the Quaker meeting houses. So anyway, it's just, it started the whole idea of this interest of, oh, these Lenapes are right in our backyard. You can do the next one. In fact, I think Hayes might be here, right here. There's sort of a goal. This is after it was excavated twice. They went back within a couple years apart. Let me see. And because of this, he thought to want to write about Indian Hannah. He found out more about her. It was excavated in 1878 and 1899, so it was sort of far apart. I'm sure they don't have the skeletons now. Lenape had a certain way buried, but these were called post-contact. They were buried like a white person would be, but they were facing east. There's an author who wrote The Lenape Among Quakers, and she thinks within a generation of her death, she was romanticized and entered in the legend as an artifact of the past, as you probably get this from now. But this was a big thing when they discovered this, because they thought, oh, well, people always found Indian artifacts like arrowheads and things, but they never thought about these huge, we're talking about huge burial grounds. Here at the next one. Because of this, he's on the left, Mr. Hayes, and he decided to plant this, put this rock, I think it's still there. It's on the Emeryville grounds, or what's the Emeryville grounds, where now West Bradford took over it, and it's where the poorhouse was, and later on some other things. It was the first, 1909, it was the first monument to her. And it was sort of confusing because it basically says, here lies Indian Hannah. But, she did die at the poorhouse, and they don't know where the first poor ground, Pottersfield was. There's another Pottersfield, or C. So there's a mystery that she was under there, and they really buried it there. But it was more of these are all men from the Historical Society and also Harrisburg. But he read his poem out loud in Last of a Race. So they wanted to honor her then, even after, long after her death. Next. This is 1972. For years and years, we only had one Lenape historian. It was this man, Rellinger, and there's a Resenlegger, pronounce this wrong. And in fact, actually, in 1972, he got interested in writing this because he oversaw or funded this excavation in Glenmore. That's near, it's now near the public park that's there, Springton Manor. And someone from Westchester University, he passed away about 3 years ago, Marshall Becker, he actually did excavation there, and they found all these, again, skeletons buried the post-white man position. But what was interesting about it was that they also discovered that a lot of the Indians who have been in other territories, which we'll see, including Big Bend, they all came up there. They tried to get out, before they finally went to Lancaster and then went on to further on, they did, every time you find a burial ground, it's likelihood that they have a settlement there. So he also, I thought it was interesting, this is sort of a crude map that he has, but he points out there's the Indian graves there, right there in the Northbrook, and then he also has the county home. But this is like, you're supposed to be able to understand it, but he did explain that we only had, these are the settlements are on the left because the Lenapes only believed that the West Branch was the official branch, and that's why they call it the Northbrook, and that's what we call Northbrook, and they call it Northbrook and Lenape. But they didn't settle on the East Branch because they thought that was sort of like a little creek or something. I don't know. He never really explains why this is so, but anyway, this is the next one. As I mentioned, the Big Bend, that's where Frolic Weymouth lived. It was open to the public, and Harlan had stayed there and squatted, and in fact, it faced the Brandywine. And if you knew Frolic Weymouth, you understood that he had all these turtle artifacts everywhere. And it's because of the Turtle Clan. This is one of the first uh, Penn decided to preserve, and they lost that as well. Again, this is because of, they might have thought, they think Indians and his relatives are originally from there. It was one of the oldest settlements. You could get the next one. What's interesting about the Indians at the Lenape is they always settled where there's something unusual. See the Big Bend? They believed in sacred places. So that was the Brandywine. That you could see Harlan's had all these most squatters took over this land. And this rock has disappeared, but it's called, this is the Lenape word for the Big Bend. But it's interesting where you find, Northbrook was considered honored place because it was on the North Branch, and it was a sacred place because it was in a sacred Brandywine. Go on and see that. Oops. You're going to go back. Oh, goodness. Does it, one more. You have to do a little bit more. Well, I don't know how much time we have here, but with the next one, this is another town, technically Indian reservation that William Penn gave back the Indians, but what's unusual about it, that the Indians themselves, the Lenape requested, it's now a part of a preserve, the Occohucking Preserve, it's on Route 3, and they requested it because not only the Crum Creek and the Chester Creek were there, they were being swamped by settlers, that they said, please give us land, our own land, and they actually surveyed it. So the Indians were part of that. That means encircling the land. Indian Hannah in her testimony said she had settled after or during the 7 Years' War, the Indian, that's another word for the French and Indian War. A lot of the people that stayed around, they were so afraid that they would not be protected. So they usually would go someplace where there was land that the Quakers, like near Philadelphia or closer, and that's why they think that she might have been there, just temporarily. That's a plaque they put up in the 20s. Next one. This is the house you could see that one of the farmers, he basically gave up his land for this reservation. And it was, all the other ones have failed, but it's the only one that's preserved, which is interesting. And almost back in the 90s, someone wanted to develop it, and people came forward, and they now, they now have made it a nice preserve. Next. This is another drawing. It's actually the drawing of her. He also has a picture of her. As I said, she was actually sort of interesting because she not only knew so much about herbal medicine, she tried to, help people all the time, going to their houses. Let's see. As I said, in the 1930s, Albert Cook really, tried to promote her as being, let's grow our own vegetables, just like Indian Hannah. As he said, this is what he said: she earned her living spinning, sewing, making brooms, weaving baskets, and working in neighboring Quaker farmers. She gained a reputation for healing the sick through her knowledge of native medicine plants. In addition, she grew corn and vegetables on her own small farm, caught fish and turtles, and raised cows and pigs. But she didn't really have any property, as we'll find out. She just moved from different places. Go ahead, next. This is funny. The testimony never mentioned this, but all the newspapers said that she lived. Britton's Ford is where Andrew Wyatt's property, the late Andrew Wyatt's property is. She was married to a man named Andrew Freeman, and that's why he was Indian. That's why Freeman means anybody that was over 21 and had land was called Freeman, and that's why you're Hannah Freeman. But it's sort of interesting that I think she lived along the Britton's Run, not exactly on this property, but right above it. I think Andrew Wyatt would have been thrilled to know the Indian Hannah settled there. The next one. You'll be surprised with this next. This is there's another picture of it. It's called Britton's Ford. Of course, they had a covered bridge at one point. Now it's Britton's Bridge Road. There's no covered bridge. Go ahead. She lived there too because there was the mill brought lots of people in, and so she could sell her baskets. It was very, it was nice to be near a mill like Newland Mill or this mill. This is a photograph by Fred Wayman. It's Lafayette's headquarters, or Gideon Gibbon. That tree was there when, Indian Hanna was there, but it's really interesting. Again, they didn't say this in testimony, but I come across things that after the Battle of Brandywine in 1777, he was so devastated he had to open a tavern, and it probably had limited number of people that he could hire, and he said he paid her like 5 shillings or something. Didn't say what she did, but basically she lived nearby so she could work as a tavern keeper, she probably cleared tables and things. So again, being someone that would be involved with the white Quakers, she was very much ingrained in the society. Go ahead. Just speed up a little bit more. This is Humphrey Marshall's home, Derby Down. It's now called Castle Rock Farm. It was just, I think the Natural Lands Trust took over. It's a very historic town, but what's interesting is Abraham Marshall, when he lived there, everybody said, he would write back to his relatives in England, and he says, I live among the Indians. And he didn't realize that he was literally living near Northbrook, which is hundreds of Indians would go through his property all the time. In fact, he used to walk until he would walk to a meeting down in Delaware until he finally started the Bradford meeting in his house, and then later on they built the Bradford meeting house. But he had several kids and one daughter named Hannah, but it's a good bet that Humphrey Marshall was only 8 years older than Hannah, Indian Hanna, so I think maybe they might have known each other if he grew up here, because she was right there in Northbrook. We never know. Go ahead. He doesn't write anything about her, and all his records, the Marshall family's records were all burned, and the relatives didn't want, it's a mystery. He's Humphrey Marshall, his cousin's better known, Bartram's Garden in Philadelphia, that's his cousin, but this is a neat house that, now we're going to, this is part of the Derby Down, but you can see the old barn. We better go a little bit faster here. Go ahead, next. It's interesting, they think that every time there was a war, that she might have, as I told you, they went to someplace safe, and this is where the British crossed at Trimble's Ford. This is right near Northbrook, and who knows if she saw the British. That would be some interesting. It's too bad no one, would interview her back then. Go ahead. Humphrey Marshall, you probably know, he's, as I said, his cousin's better known, but basically he was a scientist, a miller, farmer, surveyor. In fact, he developed what they call the first book on native plants. It's the first book in America that was published in America by an American on American subject. And it's very important because at that point we wanted independence. So he was proving that we have our own plants here. And he did this. They say at the time, England didn't even have any, like a fall like we do. But he ended up doing trading plants, and they bought a lot of our hardwood trees. But anyway, he was very supportive of Indian Hanna, and you wonder, she knows all about herbs, and he wrote, here's this book. You could see he also was astronomer. He was so into science that he had one of the first cataract surgery in 1790 in Philadelphia. Can you imagine that, having cataract surgery? That thing, you could do the next one. So, by the way, those are called beans. Those are Indian Hanna beans that are renamed for her. The next one, the book you don't see, but this is the one. It's called American Grove, and it's really a catalog of all the native plants, and people in London could order from it. And he would grow these plants, and he got these plants because he had Moses Marshall, the same guy that did the testimony. He would travel down to South Carolina and all the Cherokee lands and get these like unusual trees, like magnolia trees and all sorts of things, and come back. In fact, they said that I told you he might have suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder because he gave it out. But at one point, they say President that Thomas, when he wanted to bring the people out west, Lewis and Clark, he first thought of asked Moses Marshall to do it because he knew all about bringing back plants, or he wanted him to go on at least on a journey out west. Go ahead. This is Marshall's house when it had an observatory. He also built this the year of the Boston Tea Party. So you can imagine he He had the first greenhouse in Chester County and the first observatory in the real scientific. He and his older wife lived here. They didn't have any children, but he dedicated his whole life to science, and I think that might be one reason why he didn't have a diary, write much about her. In fact, there's no photos of him either or paintings, even though he went into Philadelphia a lot and he would have met people like Benjamin West or other people. But he was very well known, as you said, dedicating that book to Ben Franklin. In fact, recently, Ben Franklin also gave him his first telescope and other things. Next one. This is Martin's Tavern. That's right across from his house. Go ahead, the next one. This is Harlan Farm. This is the starting point with the famous Mason and Dixon. They stayed there in order to make this long, long journey to resurvey the Mason-Dixon line. And that was because Lord Baltimore was saying that you took our territory, and they always said we would have been more Catholic instead of English Quaker if it wasn't for it. But this is the time when, the Indian Hannah was staying with the Marshall Territory. So you wonder what she thought about these, they call them the stargazers, because the farmers saw them looking up at the stars. One of his Humphrey Marshall's relatives, Joel Bailey, who was related through marriage, he was a clockmaker, but he devised all these ways, they actually charted the course of Venus during this whole trip. And he made these things to carry rods because they had to be protected too by all the Indians, because they would go all the way down this, I don't know how long the Mason-Dixon line is, but it's very long. Next one. That's what Adrian did this painting. It's framed here. You could see Humphrey Marshall's facing you and the Mason-Dixon on either side, but he has, that's a Algonquin Indian there. He's more like a bodyguard. He think they had to hire Indians because they didn't want to be attacked while they were making their survey. And these are free blacks that I think their name is Spence. This is Adrian researched this, but it's likely you wonder if Indian Hannah ever worked here, because she had experience working in a tavern. But anyway, we don't know. We could just guess. Next one. The Pierce's house. This is right in Longwood Gardens. She was known for trading. There were two brothers, actually two twins, and they actually had Pierce's Park predated Longwood Gardens. They had a huge lake, and everybody went there. And they traded so many plants with Humphrey Marshall that later on they traced it to way back when Humphrey Marshall was started, that Louis XIV had the big gardens in France. He had his correspondence with Humphrey to say he wanted plants. But this is really important because she could tell him about native plants. At one point it said that she came to, someone needed to be bled, and she came to help bleed the person, they thought that would help the person who was sick next time. So this is this is very near the Webb. That's really near the Pierce house, but the Webb is related to the DuPonts. And you wonder why the Indian Hannah is always associated with Kennett Square. It's because of the DuPonts. Go ahead. One of the things, this is a tavern. It was later on, it was called the Anvil Tavern. Remember I told you when she was staying at the Webb house, a lot of her friends, or women, not her friends, or family and relatives, they all had tents along here, or cabins, and the newspapers would call them wigwams. This is, go the next one, you can guess what this is. The newspapers would, again, write all about this, like, of course they didn't live in wigwams, but that's how they described them. This is how it looks now. There's the Anvil thing. That was also a revolutionary site. By the way, one of the Pierces, he was a doctor, so he got lots of information on local herbs from her. Let me see, go ahead. They describe the wigwams in the winter. They reminisce about 50 years ago. They remember. They would publish these books, these columns about someone that remembered something way back. Now, I thought this is so funny. This is from a newspaper column. You have Mr. Pierre Dupont. You have a relative of the Webbs in the 1920s. And you have, you think his name, Chief Strong something. I thought when I was asking someone, I said, well, he looks a Western Indian. Is he a real Indian, and they told me, oh, he was from Oklahoma, which is where the Lenapes eventually went. Go ahead and do that. You can see the better picture there. If you remember here, that used to be on 952, or was it 952? Or anyway, they moved it, and now it's near was the Longwood meeting house, the progressive meeting, and it looks like it's right there, and it said something like she was, Indian Hannah was born over Vale, so it looks sort of like, they should have put a sign, and it makes it seem like she was born in the parking lot of Longwood Gardens. Go ahead. The next one. Does that work? Oh yeah, there he is. What was his name? Anyway, he was supposedly, he was the Indian. Every time Mr. DuPont wanted some kind of ceremony, Indian strong wolf, he would come out, this is from 1925, and do this dedication. Go ahead. So that's why she got really, now we jumped, sorry, from a fake Indian to a real Indian, but this is the thing that scared everybody, and including Hannah's relatives. It's called the Paxton Massacre. This is the Paxtons. I won't say that, they called them boys, but they're really men. And this is a time when they thought that the government was being too cooperative with the Indians, and their Indians were just these sort of like they were not even human. But anyway, they apparently, this is from an 1810, they murdered all of them, but there were 6 remaining ones, and they put them in a prison, which you see behind them, and then someone went back and murdered them. There was a snowstorm, so that no one could get to them to help, but they broke into the prison and killed the remaining 16. But this was such a big thing, it shocked everybody that when it happened in 1763, that Ben Franklin wrote all this. He tried to intervene, and he tried to get the Paxton boys to be arrested, and they were not. But again, it all had to do with the fact that at that point, all poor people, they were Scotch-Irish, didn't have that much land, and they were saying that, we need, the government's giving this Indian land back, but they really weren't. But anyway, go ahead. We didn't even talk about the walking purchase, but I end up with this thing where what the final thing is, we're getting towards the end. It's really interesting that actually the Lenape, they ended up going to Lancaster, and then eventually went south, and they joined the Cherokees. So they were actually, if you want to know, there were some Lenapes that they came like 3 weeks ago to Westchester University. They were from Oklahoma. They still try to, there was a woman that's trying to bring back the language again. So these are Oklahoma Lenape descendants, the next. And everybody thinks about, they all know about the Trail of Tears, but it's really a lot of Trail of Tears. You can see how many trails they were. So basically, Indian Hannah, where she was when they first did this, and they did this after what the 1830 was the Indian Removal Act. And you could imagine why we would have any Lenape left after all this. Next thing, we're going towards the end. Final thing is, I probably left this, kindness extended. A year after she got her testimony, they hadn't started the poorhouse yet. They hadn't built it yet, but they thought that decided they had to take care of her. So all these people signed this agreement, and they actually set up, just like the Quakers, they even had like a shareholder, they had a secretary, they had a recording secretary. At least 30 from Kennett Square, or Kennett Township, were supporters. And some people, if they didn't want her to stay at the house, she was supposed to stay agreed for 8 weeks or up to 2 weeks. 8 weeks or 2 weeks. But sometimes they kept a diary, and one guy, he said, Indian Hannah's still there. She's supposed to be, she's been here for 6 weeks. She was supposed to leave weeks ago. But anyway, the other ones, if they didn't stay there, you could give money for her support. But yeah, they had a president, treasurer, and 2 years of monthly meetings before they decided to do this. But this is a really neat document. Go ahead. So that's what they said, kindness extended. And mostly it was at Marshallton, the Friends, look at all the oak trees. If you go to Friends meeting today in West Bradford, there's no oak trees. But anyway, that's where they all convened. And of course, Abraham Marshall started that, and Humphrey Marshall's father started this. Next one. We're almost done with this, but I thought it was really interesting. Many of the relatives that helped Indian Hannah, they all ended up helping their relatives help on the Underground Railroad, including the Cox family here, the next one. I didn't even mention the Bernards, the Taylors, the Marshall, the Harlan families, the Pyle families. That's their house that's now on, the bypass that Longwood has sort of moved back. Anyway, go ahead, turn in that. So anyway, this is one of the last markers. It's on, it's right down from Marshallton and where Northbrook Road goes off. What road is that? Well, anyway, this is where it was part of the Humphrey Marshall's land, but there's actually a marker, and it's too bad this is black and white, but this is where they said that when she left again, there were so many bluebells. But it's funny that they still have a marker that was put up like in 1924 that's still there. And it's a private property actually now. Next one. Okay, this is the first poorhouse. Emeryville was famous. It was so famous, this thing, because actually Charles Dickens wanted to see it because it was a working farm. People learned how to do things. And so they weren't unlike England, if you throw in the poorhouse, that was it. You never could get out. But she was the first non-white person described as non-white, along with Black Phyllis, they called her that. She came in here. Now, my theory is that they were ready to build the poorhouse, but a lot of people, including the Harlan family, gave land, and I think they were all sort of tired of taking care of her, and they thought, well, there's how many people? So they built this thing for 200 people, and like within a year, it was capacity. In fact, because it was the first county, the first house. As I said, there was many different things. It ended up being a line-in, a hospital, nursing home, and it was actually, they had children there. The children had to be bound out and apprentices. So it was just really, when she first moved there in the year it was built, it must have been really just a really exploding of activity with children and people, and they didn't have any separate rooms. They didn't have any, they had like one floor, it reminded me of we have a shelter in Westchester, and they only had enough room for 4 women, and then the rest were all men. But eventually they separated people. When the visitors, they would write these little reports for the newspaper, and they noticed they were having all these pregnancies, so they better separate the women and the men. Anyway, go ahead next. We have 2 more here. Oops, go ahead. I might have the... Okay, I couldn't get a picture of the poorhouse, but this is where they stayed. In fact, it said, I tried to track her down, and it's really a mystery. As soon as she went in there, they never wrote about her again. And yet they had to write, as I said, these visitors came in, because it was run by taxpayers, it cost they had to report all these things they did. They actually made more profit from the people. It cost $7,000, $8,000 to maintain, but they brought in tons of money from all the things, from the lime kiln, from the quarries and quails, and then they also had meats and that they sold, and you could go and get baskets, which they never said whether she continued her baskets, brooms and everything. It's just amazing that they had, but as I quoted this woman that was a poorhouse expert, and she said, visitors, merchants, farmers, and members of the community were continually interacting with these communities and fundamentally part of the process of coping with the poor. So if she only lasted 2 years in here, but you wonder if she would ever come, if she ever became part of the neighborhood and why they stopped talking about her. As I said, the year she moved in, it said they had 27 beds, but they only had like 14 sheets. They didn't really count out. So anyway, can you imagine, she gave up being over near that previous picture we saw near the lake, and she had her dogs and her cow, had to give everybody up and then go in here. You had to be completely stripped down, just like a prison, and they would take any of your possessions and they would put it away for later. Because the idea is that you were going to eventually, if you were pregnant, you would eventually leave the poorhouse. But some people, or if you were old, they just didn't want you to have any possessions. But go ahead. This is the last thing. That is just a list. This is like 1800s, a list of the expenditures that they published all the time. So we're almost done here. One more thing. So it's interesting that they wouldn't say, at least she found, I often think it's along the Brandywine, and it was very scenic. It was the most scenic farm. It actually had steam heat. It had, laundry, very modern, and running water, even for her. even that early time, 1800, when it opened, 1801. So next one, we have the picture of the lime kiln. Is that? No, that's a rock. That is, I thought it was a lime kiln. That's a kid from the 1950s looking in front of the rock. One more final thing. That's a picture of it when it became the Insane Society. They didn't knock down all that building. In fact, they also knocked down the big, huge barn. I know someone that grew up there, and she said that her father worked for the county home, and he said, this is a perfectly fine barn. This is like in the 40s, and they said, we want it gone. And then as soon as they left, they realized they didn't have any place to put anything. But anyway, next one. So that's gone too. But here's a lime kiln. But anyway, so people bought lime for fertilizer and for building. So this is like a gold mine if you had a lime kiln. Go ahead. This is going towards, now it's protected. It's a potter's field. I call this the bridge to nowhere, and they don't think she was buried there. If you go to the next one, we think that it was buried in another potter's field that was closer to the original building. But unfortunately, if you ever go to there, this is taken from Hunt Magazine. I did a story on it. They have all numbers on that, but they had the numbers of who was buried there, but the building that was stored and burned down, like in the 30s, and so they have no idea where these people are. But it's surely not Indian Hannah. Someone did plant all the trees that are still there at the four corners. I think we have that's, and one more thing, there's one more slide. This is the one, this is recreated. We were afraid that Emeryville was going to be developed, and luckily West Bradford bought it, and we're going to have open space. And that was, they recreated this plaque that's closer to the other road, 162. So that will end it, and it was put up by the Martin's Tavern people. So she was remembered back in, I guess it was in 2009. We were still talking about her. Anyway, is there any more questions? Any questions about her? We went over a little bit, yeah. Yes.
Did the Lenape move to North Carolina before 1836 when there was the Trail of Tears?
Oh, I was told that, yeah. Yeah. Well, they first initially went to, they left her behind. Well, they went, actually, someone went to New Jersey, and then they found that was really developed, but they went up to Lancaster, the Conestoga Indians, and then after that Paxton happened and the Paxton Massacre, then they went further, but they did. They went down long before the Trail of Tears. They settled in South Carolina, North Carolina, and there's no, as I said, it's really strange. There was hardly any Lenape left, and the ones that were, say, in Philadelphia, that were integrated, they were usually more like the Lenape tribe that was like from New York area. But no Brandywine Turtle Clan, they were completely gone, Anyway, yeah. Oh, well, I should have said natives. You're right, Native Americans, but I'm so used to saying Indian because it's easier to say, but I should say Native American. And I said, I apologize. They shouldn't have put on this plaque Indian Hannah, because basically we know, she's Indian, she's Hannah Freeman. But they wanted to replicate the one that was on before. But that's just, it's natives. Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's what I meant to put that in. It's really strange. They never put that down. And I think it's because, if she was born at the Webbs and she grew up, they let her, it was almost like I said, parallel lives. She would be allowed to play with the Quaker children and maybe learn how to sew, but that was just in the winter, like be extra hands. And then, sorry, you go out and but don't hang around. But they never found out what her original is. I thought that testimony was strange. It said, Indian Hannah, her alias is Hannah Freeman. I know, they don't know. In fact, they kept claiming her testimony is too bad they didn't do a better testimony than ask, what that was. But anyway. Yeah. Anybody else?
Time for one more question?
Oh, they think she never had children, but her husband, again, she was born relatively late. A lot of the husbands all had to leave. they would claim they would go up to like, say Harrisburg area, which is Paxton and Samokin and other places, and they would just never come back. They were used to going up there up and down and traveling all the time. So there were so many women that were, single women here. So yes, yeah, and they named, we don't know his native name either, but they called him Andrew Freeman, and Freeman is just a normal name you give for someone that has, that's 21 or, doesn't have land or does have land anyway. They're inmate, you're inmate if you have land, but you're a free man if you're 21 but you don't have land. Okay, anything?
Is this presentation published or in a film anywhere?
There are cameras recording this, so we hope to find someone to edit it so that we can put it on our YouTube, Kennet Heritage Center's YouTube channel. Welcome.
Oh, good, yeah.
All right, well, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, thanks. That was a lot.
There's not much to edit except for this one,
Yeah, and then also, I did the battery, and then that too.
Yeah.